For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and agree to the bill S-1067.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1067, an act to support stabilization and lasting peace in northern Uganda and areas affected by the Lord's Resistance Army through development of a regional strategy to support multilateral efforts to successfully protect civilians and eliminate the threat posed by the Lord's Resistance Army, and to authorize funds for humanitarian relief and reconstruction, reconciliation and transitional justice, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the bill and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill under consideration today is the companion to H.R. 2478, legislation authored by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern. I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Mr. McGovern, for championing the cause of the people of northern Uganda, who have been victimized for over 2 decades by the Lord's Resistance Army, a group designated as a terrorist organization by the Secretary of State. Mr. Speaker, it's almost impossible to describe the horrors that the Lord's Resistance Army, also known as the LRA, has perpetrated on the people of northern Uganda and more recently in several neighboring countries. Joseph Kony, the LRA leader, has led a militia group responsible for the slaughter of thousands of people and the displacement of over 2 million others since it was formed in 1986. The LRA is most notorious for abducting young children, an estimated 30,000 over the past 2 decades, and forcing them into armed service and sexual servitude. While claiming to represent the legitimate grievances of the Okoli people of northern Uganda, Kony has exploited those grievances to justify what only can be described as madness in his pursuit of power. The Ugandan war is now the longest-running war in Africa, longer than the conflict in Sudan. During the course of this war, the LRA has been responsible for widespread human rights violations, including murder, abduction, mutilation, sexual enslavement of women and children, and forcing children to participate in killing of Ugandans, often family members and neighbors. The LRA shows no mercy for the young. Boys are kidnapped and turned into soldiers. Girls are kidnapped and used as sex slaves. And to terrorize communities, the LRA often amputates limbs and disfigures bodies as so-called lessons learned for those willing to resist. The Ugandan government and the LRA began peace negotiations in 2006 and signed an agreement in August of that year, which provided for hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people to return home in safety. A final peace agreement was reached in 2008, but Kony refused to sign, and the LRA subsequently launched new attacks on civilians in eastern Congo. Despite the LRA leader's refusal to sign the agreement, the Ugandan government has made a commitment to carry out reconstruction plans for northern Uganda and to implement those mechanisms of the final peace agreement not conditioned on the compliance of the LRA. Mr. Speaker, the United States government is a friend to the people of northern Uganda, and it is in our interest to help rid Uganda and Central Africa of the LRA. This bill authorizes the President to provide additional assistance to respond to the humanitarian needs of populations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Southern Sudan, and Central African Republic affected by LRA activity. It further authorizes the President to support efforts by the people of northern Uganda and the government of Uganda to promote transitional justice and reconciliation on both local and national levels. Mr. Speaker, it is important that we pass this legislation today to draw attention to the LRA's reign of terror and to demonstrate our support for the people of Uganda. Mr. Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
For what reason does the gentlelady from Florida rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
I thank the gentleman. I strongly support the policy objectives of Senate Bill 1067, the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act. For nearly 27 years, the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, has been terrorizing civilians, leaving a trail of death and despondency in its wake. The LRA's leader is a soulless mass murderer who has perpetrated some of the most deplorable human rights atrocities known to man. The LRA is a predatory guerrilla force. They mutilate, torture, rape, and murder with impunity. They have abducted tens of thousands of civilians, mostly children, to serve as soldiers or sex slaves. Abducted children are forced to the front lines, and those who manage to escape find it difficult, if not impossible, to return home after being forced to commit atrocities in front of their very own families. While the LRA has withdrawn from northern Uganda and security conditions there have improved, it continues to wreak havoc on neighboring southern Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic. Recent reports indicate that rather than being weakened, the LRA today is stronger and strategically more sophisticated than it was just last year. The bill before us seeks to change that. It requires the President to develop a comprehensive strategy to deal with the LRA. It offers political, economic, military, and intelligence support for viable multilateral efforts to protect civilians, to apprehend or eliminate top LRA commanders, and disarm and demobilize remaining LRA fighters. It then expresses a sense of Congress that the United States should support humanitarian efforts in LRA-affected areas, as well as programs to advance transitional justice in northern Uganda. I appreciate the chairman's efforts to ensure that this language does not represent an earmark in funding, which would conflict with Republican members' commitment to the American taxpayer to exercise fiscal restraint and discipline. I also appreciate that the bill conditions future assistance to the government of Uganda upon transparency and a substantial commitment of Uganda's own resources to support reconstruction efforts in the north. Mr. Speaker, the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs has said that this conflict is, quote, characterized by a level of cruelty seldom seen, and few conflicts rival it for its sheer brutality, end quote. Even so, it remains one of the most overlooked humanitarian and human rights crises in the world today. The fact that we're even debating this topic today is largely due to the tireless efforts of young advocates throughout the United States, including in my own congressional district, who have passionately taken up the cause of those whose lives have been destroyed by the LRA. I urge my colleagues to join them in supporting the objectives of this important bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield 4 minutes to a gentleman from Massachusetts, the Vice Chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern.
The gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New York for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important day for U.S. policy in Africa. Just about 1 year ago, on May 19th, my friend and colleague from California and a champion of human rights, Congressman Ed Royce, and I introduced H.R. 2478, the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Recovery Act. In the Senate, Senators Russ Feingold and Sam Brownback sponsored the same bill, S. 1067, which is the bill before us for consideration today. Today, H.R. 2478 has 200 bipartisan co-sponsors. When the House passes S. 1067 today, it will be sent directly to the President's desk for his signature, and for the first time, the U.S. will be required to design and implement a comprehensive strategy with our multilateral and regional partners to address the violence of the LRA, protect the victims of LRA violence in Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Southern Sudan, and the Central African Republic, strengthen state presence and capacity in these regions to the benefit of the vulnerable civilian populations, and advance the recovery of northern Uganda from decades of violence. Mr. Speaker, a great deal has happened across the country to ensure that this bill is before the House chamber today in scarcely 1 year. I want to especially recognize and thank the national networks, organizations, and grassroots activists of Invisible Children, Resolve Uganda, the Enough Project, and many other religious and human rights groups who have rallied in support of the people and especially the children of this region of Africa. These Americans, thousands of them high school and college students, understood that the children and people of northern Uganda, the DRC, Southern Sudan, and the CAR have no voice in Washington. So they were determined to become their voice. They realized that these African children and families were invisible to Washington policymakers, so they decided to make them visible. They realized there is too much suffering, too much pain, too much destruction, too much killing in this region of Africa, so many thousands of miles away, and that there was just too much silence here in Washington. So they built a grassroots and national movement of hope for peace, for justice, for reconciliation, for reconstruction, for the recovery of the human spirit. They believe that the people of northern Uganda, the children of Uganda, the DRC, Southern Sudan, and the CAR have a right to protection and to have a voice in their own destiny. So today is a good day, a very good day, Mr. Speaker, because today these hundreds of thousands of voices have brought this bill to the House floor today for final passage. The unresolved crisis with the Lord's Resistance Army is one of Africa's longest-running and most gruesome militia-driven conflicts. It has morphed into a sadistic force wreaking terror on the local populations, filling its ranks with abducted child soldiers and slaves. Now, at this critical juncture in the conflict's history, and when the terror once focused in northern Uganda is spreading throughout the region and surrounding countries, we must ensure that the United States commit to a proactive strategy to help see this conflict to its end, protect vulnerable populations, and support and strengthen recovery efforts in northern Uganda and the region. I thank the many Americans, especially the young people, who have supported this bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote in support of final passage of S. 1067, and I ask unanimous consent to submit materials into the record. And I thank the gentleman from New York again for his leadership, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentlewoman from Florida, for reason you rise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health.
Without objection.
I thank my good friend for yielding, and I ask unanimous consent to revise to the extent of my remarks.
Without
Mr.
objection.
Speaker, I rise in support of the condemnation of the Lord's Resistance Army expressed in S. 1067 and the bill's goal of supporting civilian protection and development in northern Uganda. 4 years ago, I chaired a hearing of the African Global Human Rights and International Operations Subcommittee on the endangered children of northern Uganda. A courageous young woman named Grace Akelo testified about her abduction at the age of 15, together with 138 classmates at a boarding school by the LRA. They and approximately 30,000 other children have endured horrifying atrocities as child soldiers and sex slaves. Ms. Akelo eventually escaped, and her remarkable story was recounted in a book entitled Girl Soldier, a story of hope for northern Uganda's children, that she co-authored with human rights activist Faith McDonald. I highly recommend the book to my colleagues and to anyone who wants to learn more about these incredible human rights violations and how we can all work together to address and to stop them. Ms. Akelo stated back in 2006 that unfortunately her story was not uncommon. And I sadly add that unfortunately it is still not uncommon. Joseph Kony continues to lead the LRA in the commission of outrageous abuses and atrocities, including the abduction, rape, and killing of innocent civilians, not only in northern Uganda, but also in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, and southern Sudan. Although Kony has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for these and other crimes against humanity, he and his cohorts have yet to be brought to justice. Mr. Speaker, we must do everything possible to stop the widespread suffering that he is inflicting and to help those who have survived his atrocities to recover. In her testimony, Ms. Akelo specifically asked for more resources to help people suffering because of this conflict, emphasizing that, quote, it will be important for the government of Uganda and the international community to provide returnees with adequate resettlement assistance and support in restoring and developing community infrastructure so that people can begin to rebuild their lives. She went on to say, I ask for your help and the help of others to take action to end this war so that my sisters and brothers and all children of northern Uganda can sleep in peace. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all of my colleagues respond to Ms. Akelo's heartfelt request, and I do hope that this resolution, this bill, will pass. Finally, I'd like to engage my good friend and colleague, the chairman from New York, Mr. Engel, in a very short colloquy. I would like a clarification that neither the term reproductive health, as it appears in the Peace, Recovery, and Development Plan for Northern Uganda, referenced in sections 6B and 8B of S1067, nor the term sexual reproductive health and rights in the Ugandan Ministry of Health's Health Sector Plan, Strategic Plan, number 2, referenced in the Peace, Recovery, and Development Plan for Northern Uganda, nor any other references in this act include access to abortion for purposes of S1067.
The gentleman from New Jersey would yield to me.
Yield to my friend.
Yes, he is correct.
I appreciate that. And I yield back the balance of my time to Ms. Ross-Layton.
The gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Miller, who is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I also rise in support of the LRA Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act of 2009. As other members have already said, for more than 20 years, the LRA has terrorized the Great Lakes region of Africa and continues to commit atrocities and abduct children across areas of northern Uganda, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Central African Republic, often targeting schools and churches. If the LRA ever sought to right some supposed wrong, if there was ever a grievance or a cause that motivated the LRA, that has all long since been forgotten. The LRA's atrocities are barbarism for barbarism's own sake. The United Nations estimates that 90% of the LRA combatants are abducted children, often as young as 10. When the horrific conflict finally ends, those children must somehow return to civilized society after learning as children to kill innocent human beings without hesitation or remorse. Since the brutal Christmas Day massacres of 2008 in Congo, the LRA has killed more than 1,000 people, abducted almost 2,000 others, and forced more than 300,000 others to flee their homes in vulnerable areas. The LRA Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act would support multilateral efforts to bring stability and peace to northern Uganda and to protect civilians from the Lord's Resistance Army. This legislation authorizes humanitarian funding for communities across Central Africa victimized by the LRA and assistance to help with recovery and reconciliation efforts in northern Uganda. This bill will help end permanently the LRA's campaign of brutality and terror and help families rebuild their lives. Please join me in supporting this legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Woman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now would like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this legislation to end the atrocities of Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army, and I am an original co-sponsor of the House version of this legislation. From my view, with the passage of this bill, which now goes to the President's desk, we now are in a situation where I think Kony's removal won't guarantee peace, but it certainly will make it possible in the region. I would also just add that the legislation has made it this far the fact that it has is really a tribute to a group of young people, young professionals, who've come up here on their own time and gone to the universities around this country to organize in order to make people aware of the plight of these children in Africa. And I really thank them for that work. Mr. Speaker, Joseph Kony is perhaps the most wanted man in Africa. He is an indicted war criminal. He is a designated terrorist. Many Americans don't know his name, but the children of Uganda and Central East Africa certainly do. He's a very sadistic figure. He has a charismatic appeal to some. He heads a group called the Lord's Resistance Army, and under his 2 decades of tyrannical leadership, that group has conscripted some 30,000 children into this killing squad. And I can tell you, as the former chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, if you talk to parents in Uganda or Congo or South Sudan or the Central African Republic, the fear they have is the fear inspired by what he has been able to do. Human rights groups report that this LRA remains powerful. It has still the ability to kill and to capture children. It may be even accelerating its program of fear and mind control over children. I'm reminded of the words of a recent researcher who interviewed a boy who escaped from the group, and he reported that he was forced to kill 8 other children who disobeyed Kony's rules in a 5-week time span. Those victims were surrounded in a circle. Children were forced to take turns bashing them with a bat in a collective kill. That's 8 times in 5 weeks. But the LRA's objective remains the same as it's been for a couple generations now: kill, capture, and resupply for its next pillage. There is no other reason for its being. Most experts agree that the removal of Kony and his top leadership would decapitate this group. Kony has long fought the government of Uganda. He has had the support of the Islamist government in Sudan for that war, which wanted to hit back at Uganda's leader for the leader's support for Christians and animists who had been targeted by the Islamist government in Sudan. Former LRA commanders report that Khartoum, that Sudan, has provided ammunition and provides intelligence training for Kony's group. More recently, there have been credible reports of the LRA gaining sanctuary in Darfur. A referendum on southern Sudan is looming next year. Unless the LRA is permanently dealt with now, you can bet that Khartoum will put this killing squad back to use again next year in South Sudan. Mr. Speaker, this civil war, originally contained within Uganda's borders, is now a regional crisis in 4 countries. This bipartisan legislation aims to spur the administration into devising a strategy to remove Joseph Kony and to remove his top commanders from the battlefield. Some targeted assistance from the U.S. could make a world of difference. I'd ask if I could
yield an additional minute to the gentleman from California.
I thank the gentlelady. The world's problems can seem overwhelming at times. It is fashionable to blame conflict in Africa on poverty and other environmental factors, but sometimes just getting rid of one person does make a big difference. History is full of captivating leaders with bad ideas who do great damage. It's a lesson I learned as chairman of the Africa Subcommittee when Liberian President Charles Taylor ran a gangster regime in West Africa that brought havoc to neighboring Sierra Leone, where he pioneered this idea of using child soldiers and using amputations and using the techniques that Joseph Kony does now. And after the hard-fought removal of Charles Taylor and after his imprisonment, that region is peaceful. Mr. Speaker, it isn't an exaggeration to say that the fate of hundreds of thousands of people, certainly of 30,000 children, rest in the hands of a few men. Kony's removal won't guarantee peace, but it will make it possible I urge the passage of this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Good deal. Thank you, Ed.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to a gentlewoman from California, Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons that we have this worthy legislation before us, and it certainly is that, is due to a group of young people who have dedicated their voices and energy to getting the heart-wrenching situation in Uganda the attention it demands. The Invisible Children Organization, which has its headquarters in my district, has brought the awful acts of the Lord's Resistance Army to light. The group has galvanized an entire generation of young people here to care about children halfway around the world. Their activism has painted for many people in our country the grim, intense reality that is faced by so many Ugandans, especially the children abducted by the LRA and forced to become child soldiers. The volunteers have traveled to our cities, our schools, our businesses, probably even to many of our offices here in Washington, to show their films and speak out against Joseph Kony and his army's brutality. These young members of the Invisible Children Organization know that no child should live in fear of being abducted, mutilated, or killed. With that belief, they have helped make the children of Uganda visible to us. And now, with this legislation, we have the chance to truly join in this cause. This bill will require the President to devise an interagency strategy to address this crisis and heighten our country's level of support for stopping the LRA. Last August, I had the privilege of speaking with members of the Invisible Children Organization who had come to San Diego for their training as, what they call them, roadies. I cannot do justice to their passion, their commitment, and their dedication to do what is right. Their energy absolutely ignites the room. Mr. Speaker, we cannot let them down, and more importantly, we cannot let down the suffering children this legislation will help. I yield back.
This is Ms. Davis.
The gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further requests for time, and I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1067? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.